So, what if I told you that the reason global supply chains are choking right now, and I mean, the reason you might be paying $5 a gallon for gas pretty soon, actually traces all the way back to this one single UN vote from 1990.
Right. Or, what if we looked at the current makeup of Congress with all the gridlock and the intense polarization and found out the blueprint for it was locked in by this quiet campaign decision made in 1992?
Which is wild to think about. And to
Yeah.
take it even further, what if the sudden death of a former CIA director wasn't natural at all, but the result of a weapon the government officially refuses to admit even exists?
Yeah, it completely reframes how you look at the news cycle. I mean, we are constantly trained to react to the immediate crisis, right? Like the
Yeah.
breaking news banner, the daily market dip.
The scandal of the week?
Exactly. But what we are really experiencing are just the shockwaves of these secret decisions and alliances that happened years or even decades ago.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We have a massive and frankly completely mind-bending mission ahead of us today. We're going to untangle this massive web of intelligence secrets, global economic choke points, and, long-term political strategies.
It is a lot of ground to cover.
It really is.
Yeah.
Our roadmap for this is a highly detailed, incredibly provocative briefing provided by a former CIA officer and whistleblower, John Kiriakou. So we're taking his analysis, combining it with our own research, and extracting the mechanics of how the hidden world actually operates.
Right. And before we get into the actual mechanics of this, because we are going to get really granular on how these power structures work, we need to pause and establish some very clear ground rules for you, the listener.
Yes, this is crucial. We need to speak directly to you right up front. The source material we are diving into today contains some highly politically charged content. I mean, it includes incredibly strong opinions, severe allegations, and criticisms that go hard after both the left wing and the right wing of American politics.
Yeah, no one is spared in this briefing.
Exactly. So we want to be incredibly explicit here. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing any of the political viewpoints. We are not validating the accusations, and we're not, championing the claims made in this briefing.
Right. Our job today is just to impartially report the contents of the material. We're here to break down the argument so you understand the underlying logic being presented.
We are your guides through the material, not the authors of it.
Exactly. We are treating the source as a complex text to be examined. We want to understand the how and the why behind the claims, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum. And there is a staggering amount of material to look at.
There really is. So we're going to be exploring 4 major themes today. We're starting with the unresolved, totally controversial Epstein Files and the brutal political retaliation against people trying to expose them.
Which is a crazy story on its own.
Oh, absolutely. From there, we map out a looming geopolitical and economic crisis centered in Yemen that most of the world is completely misinterpreting right now.
Yeah, that one has huge implications for your wallet, frankly.
For sure. Then, we uncover the hidden shadow of a domestic political strategy from the early 1990s that still dictates American elections today. And finally, we'll examine the mysterious circumstances around the death of a former CIA director. So let's just jump right in. Segment 1, the Epstein Files and the remarkably high price of transparency.
Right. So to set the table for this, we need to look at the catalyst that dragged this whole thing back into the immediate spotlight. It comes from a recent media appearance that totally fractured the established political narrative on government transparency.
Yeah, we are talking about JD Vance's recent appearance on the Joe Rogan Show. During that interview, Vance brought up the Trump administration's handling of the Jeffrey Epstein files, and he openly admitted that the administration, quote, mishandled the release of these documents.
Yeah, he suggested they were guilty of poor communication around the issue.
Right. And he just casually stated that in hindsight, they probably should have just dropped all the documents at the very beginning of the term to, get it out of the way.
Which is a staggering way to frame the issue when you actually understand the gravity and the sheer volume of what is being kept in the dark here.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this for a second. Because to me, listening to that clip, the tone is just wild.
It's very nonchalant.
Exactly. It sounds like a tech executive doing a casual retrospective on a failed smartphone launch. Like, oh yeah, we probably should have used different packaging, my bad.
Right, right.
But we aren't talking about a consumer product. We are talking about one of the most prolific international blackmail and trafficking rings in modern history.
Mm-hmm.
How does a sitting vice president talk about an open, highly active intelligence case as if it's just ancient history?
That casual tone is exactly the discrepancy the source zeroes in on. To understand why that framing is so jarring, you really have to look at the raw numbers.
Yeah.
And the absolute ironclad blockade that was put in place to prevent the public from seeing this stuff. According to the briefing, about 3 million pages of documents related to the Epstein case were released. But that leaves another 3 to 3.5 million pages that have not been released, and the legal deadline for that release has long passed.
Yeah, it's 7 months past the deadline of December 19th, to be exact. And what's critical here is that this release wasn't just some gentle suggestion, right?
Yeah, not at all.
The Epstein Files Transparency Act was formal legislation, sponsored by Republican Thomas Massie and Democrat Ro Khanna. And it passed with overwhelming, almost unheard-of bipartisan support. I mean, the vote in the House of Representatives was 419-1. In the Senate, it was 99-0.
Yeah, it is practically a mathematical impossibility to get that level of unified agreement in modern politics. I mean, you can barely get a 419-1 vote to declare that water is wet.
Exactly, and President Trump signed it into law.
Yeah.
So, mechanically speaking, the legislative branch demanded it, the executive branch signed it, and then just nothing.
Right. According to the source, the administration simply refused to comply with the rest of the release. The briefing specifically highlights a claim made by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. She stated that the president told her directly to her face that he will never release the remaining 3.5 million documents because, quote, "it'll hurt my friends."
Which is just, wow.
Yeah, and this is where the theoretical concept of transparency collides violently with the actual mechanics of political power. Because the Republicans who pushed for this transparency, the ones who took that 419-1 vote, seriously faced immediate, devastating retaliation from within their own party.
The source goes through this political hit list, and the level of coordinated vengeance is shocking. Let's look at Thomas Massie, the co-sponsor of the act.
Yeah.
Overnight, he became one of the White House's top political targets.
Right.
Outside super PACs suddenly flooded his district, spending $35 million to oust him from his congressional seat, and Trump personally flew to his district to hold a rally against him.
We really need to pause and look at the mechanics of that $35 million because a a political action committee that can raise and spend unlimited money from corporations and individuals, it doesn't just casually drop $35 million on a random congressional primary.
No, never.
In the ecosystem of campaign finance, that is an astronomical, civilization-ending amount of money for a single House seat. It is designed not just to defeat a candidate, but to absolutely obliterate them and send a chilling message to anyone else watching.
It's a show of overwhelming financial force.
Exactly.
And the message was received.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just Massie. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who up until that point was one of the administration's most loyal supporters, was essentially forced to resign.
Yeah, the source details how her teenage son started receiving credible death threats.
Right. And according to Kiriakou's briefing, when she went directly to the president to ask for Secret Service protection or some kind of federal help for her family, he allegedly told her, "Tough luck. You should have thought about that before you opened your mouth."
Wow. If we connect this to the broader structural picture, it shows that pushing for the release of these specific pages was treated as an unforgivable act of treason within the party. The retaliation was totally systematic.
Yeah, look at Nancy Mason, South Carolina.
Right. She decided to run for governor, immediately lost Trump's endorsement, and as a sitting congresswoman with high name recognition, she ended up coming in 5th place. Her political capital was entirely evaporated from the top down.
But the example that really highlights the sheer panic inside the executive branch is what happened to Representative Lauren Boebert. The source states that she was physically brought into the Situation Room, the White House Situation Room.
Which is insane.
Right. She was brought in for a meeting with highly senior officials, specifically including FBI Director Kash Patel and Attorney General Pam Bondi. And the sole purpose of this meeting, in the most secure room on the planet, was to pressure her to drop her name from a discharge petition regarding these files.
Yeah, we have to explain the mechanics of a discharge petition here because it explains the panic. In the House, the Speaker controls the floor. If the Speaker doesn't want a bill voted on, it dies in committee. It never sees the light of day.
Right.
But a discharge petition is a parliamentary procedure that lets the rank-and-file members completely bypass the Speaker. If you can get 218 signatures, an absolute majority of the House, it forces the bill directly onto the floor for a mandatory vote.
So it's essentially a mutiny. It overrides the leadership's blockade.
Exactly. It strips their power to hide the legislation. Boebert signing that petition meant they were getting dangerously close to forcing the release of those documents.
Yeah.
But let's look at the venue they chose to stop her. The Situation Room, or the SCIF.
Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. Yeah.
Right. This is a subterranean complex designed for managing global nuclear crises, hot wars, and catastrophic intelligence failures. It is heavily monitored, deeply intimidating, and completely cut off from the outside world.
And no cell phones allowed, right?
What? Exactly. No electronics. So using that specific room alongside the director of the FBI and the attorney general to pressure a single representative about a procedural petition, I mean, it signals that whatever is in those withheld pages is viewed by the executive branch not as a political embarrassment, but as a supreme national security crisis.
Which is terrifying. So keeping all of that intense career-ending retaliation and SCIF-level intimidation in mind, we have to circle back to JD Vance on the Joe Rogan show.
Right.
To deflect from this brutal internal fallout and the broken campaign promises, Vance attempts to shift the narrative. And in doing so, he launches some massive, almost casual accusations against the U.S. intelligence community. Which brings us to our second segment: blame, data brokers, and destroyed evidence.
Yeah, the pivot Vance makes during that interview is a classic maneuver of muddying the waters. Instead of addressing the $3.5 million withheld pages or the $35 million spent to destroy Massey, he attempts to shift the focus entirely onto Democratic Representative Ro Khanna. Vance claims that Khanna only cared about the Epstein issue when Donald Trump was in office, framing the whole pursuit as purely partisan harassment.
Yeah, but the source immediately points out that mechanically and chronologically, that argument falls apart. First of all, Donald Trump had already been president during a previous term, and he didn't release the documents then either when he had full executive authority to do it.
Exactly.
Furthermore, the Republican Party literally campaigned heavily against Kamala Harris on the explicit promise that they would be the ones to finally release the files.
Yeah.
You can't campaign on a promise, break it, and then blame the opposition for asking you to fulfill it.
No, you really can't. But Vance goes further to complicate the narrative. He claims that part of the delay and the heavy redactions in the documents that were released is because the line between victim and co-conspirator is incredibly blurry.
Oh.
He implies that some of the loud voices demanding total transparency might accidentally expose people who are victims of the trafficking ring, but who are also forced to be complicit in it. It's a rhetorical way of saying this situation is far too legally complex for public consumption, so we have to hide it for their own good.
But then Vance drops the real bombshell.
Yeah.
And he does it so casually. He brings up the widely speculated idea that Jeffrey Epstein had deep ties to the highest levels of Israeli and American intelligence, specifically mentioning the Mossad, the CIA, or a generalized deep state.
Yeah.
And then he says, and I'm closely paraphrasing the clip cited in the source here, that while he has actively asked for documents connecting Epstein to these agencies and was told they don't exist, he followed it up by saying, if that documentary evidence did exist, it wouldn't exist anymore. Quote, if that stuff existed, it wouldn't exist in 2026.
Yes. He is overtly suggesting that the evidence has been destroyed.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly, legally perilous. Did a sitting vice president just casually accuse the Central Intelligence Agency of a federal felony?
Yes. Yes, he did.
Because destroying official classified intelligence documents to cover up a relationship with a high-profile international sex trafficker isn't just bad optics. It is severe obstruction of justice.
Yeah.
It's a crime. So I have to ask, what is the actual difference between political messaging on a podcast and actual intelligence evidence here?
That is the absolute crucial distinction that Kiriakou makes as a former CIA officer. He points out the absurdity of the venue. Vance is the vice president of the United States. He has a permanent seat at the highest intelligence tables in the world.
Right. He can literally call the CIA director right now.
Exactly. He has the director of national intelligence, the CIA, and the FBI on speed dial. He has the statutory authority to demand briefings at the highest levels of classification. If a sitting vice president genuinely believed, with evidence, that the CIA was actively destroying classified documents, he has the power and the constitutional duty to launch a massive federal investigation, involve the inspector general, and send people to federal prison.
But he doesn't do that. Instead, he just floats it as a speculative theory on a comedy and culture podcast.
Right. And that is why Kiriakou identifies this purely as messaging, not as the presentation of evidence. The message is meticulously designed to throw a bone to the populist base, to validate their suspicions about the intelligence community, without actually pointing a finger at the Trump administration's own failure to release the files.
This pressure release valve.
Exactly. But what is fascinating is that Kiriakou's own professional analysis of the underlying situation is equally startling, though much more grounded in tradecraft. Based on his experience, he states unequivocally that he believes Jeffrey Epstein was a Mossad access agent.
Okay, we need to define that term. Because when people hear agent, they think of James Bond stealing blueprints from a safe. But an access agent operates very differently. Walk us through the mechanics of what an access agent actually does.
Right. An access agent is rarely a trained intelligence officer. They don't typically pick locks or steal secrets themselves. An access agent is an asset whose primary value is their wealth, their exclusive properties, their philanthropic cover, and their elite social standing.
Ah, so they provide the venue.
Exactly. Their job is to create a honey trap or a controlled environment. They host the parties, they fly the private jets, and they bring high-value targets, politicians, nuclear scientists, military leaders, tech billionaires, into an isolated space where those targets feel safe enough to let their guard down.
And once the target lets their guard down, they are compromised.
Precisely. The access agent facilitates the environment where the target engages in illegal or highly embarrassing behavior, which is secretly recorded. That compromising material is then handed over to the actual intelligence officers who use it to blackmail or control the target.
It makes perfect operational sense.
It really does. Kiriakou says it makes total sense that Epstein functioned this way. He had the unexplained wealth, the private island, the Manhattan townhouse, and the endless roster of powerful guests. Kiriakou suggests all the evidence points to Epstein acting as a primary access agent for the Mossad, but that he likely also brokered information with the FBI, British intelligence, and even actively sought a meeting with Putin, though the Russians reportedly declined.
It's an entire economy of blackmail. And Kiriakou mentions in the source that he has received death threats just for stating this professional opinion publicly.
Wow.
But, when you look at the sheer scale of the Epstein Files, 3.5 million withheld pages, it begs a very practical, logistical question about how the executive branch operates. Are the president and the vice president actually sitting in the Oval Office reading through 3 million pages of raw FBI interviews and flight logs?
Kiriakou gives a definitive no to that. And this brings us to the actual mechanics of how a president consumes information. It is done through the Presidential Daily Brief, known as the PDB. The PDD is the ultimate distillation of the most highly classified intelligence gathered by the entire U.S. apparatus over the last 24 hours. And the ironclad rule of the PDB is that it is never, ever more than 16 pages long.
Wait. 16 pages.
Yeah.
To cover every geopolitical crisis, terrorist threat, and intelligence operation on the entire globe.
Yes. Kiriakou recounts this deeply humbling story from his early days at the CIA, specifically assigned to write items for the PDB. He drafted what he thought was a brilliant, nuanced, multi-page analysis of a complex situation. His boss called him into his office, tossed the draft back across the desk, and brutally told him that the President of the United States does not care about a junior analyst's opinions.
Ouch.
Yeah. He was ordered to condense this massive, complex global issue into a single, highly readable paragraph. There are simply not enough hours in the day for the executive branch to read raw files. They rely entirely on summaries.
Which means they rely entirely on the people curating those summaries. The power doesn't just lie with the person reading the PDB. It lies with the mid-level bureaucrats deciding what makes it into those 16 pages and what gets left on the cutting room floor. If you control the summary, you control the president's worldview.
Exactly. And this ties into a much deeper, more personal theme the source brings up regarding secrecy and the terrifying reality of exposure in the modern digital age. Kiriakou shifts from the macro level of national intelligence to the micro level of personal security.
Right. He talks about his own life as a whistleblower.
Yeah, how he went public in the 2000s about the CIA's use of waterboarding, the powerful enemies he made by doing so, and the federal prison time he served. Because of that history, he emphasizes how incredibly easy it is for adversaries to find you today using online data brokers.
He specifically mentions using a commercial service called Delete Me, right, to constantly scrub his family's personal data addresses, phone numbers, relatives from the internet because the threat of retaliation is so persistent and real.
Right. And think about the logical extrapolation of that fear. If a former, highly trained CIA counterterrorism agent is that paranoid about data exposure from everyday internet data brokers. Imagine the stakes for a national intelligence agency trying to protect or hide high-level international assets.
The lengths they would go to.
Exactly. The lengths they would go to in order to keep those 3.5 million pages of Epstein files hidden. The secrets in those pages aren't just embarrassing. They have geopolitical consequences. They dictate who is being blackmailed and who is secretly pulling the levers of power.
It's a massive blind spot. And while the political class in D.C. is locked in this bitter, internal, incredibly distracting war over hidden documents and podcast messaging, they are missing a massive, immediate crisis brewing overseas.
Yeah, an obsession with domestic political survival is blinding them to global adversaries.
Right, and that failure to understand the capabilities of those adversaries is currently threatening to plunge the entire world into a severe economic depression. Which brings us precisely to our third segment, the Yemen blockade and a geopolitical tinderbox.
This is the material that actually keeps intelligence analysts awake at night. We are moving from the hidden files in Washington to a very visible, very dangerous strategic choke point in the Middle East. The source introduces breaking news that the Houthi rebels in Yemen have announced a complete naval blockade against Saudi Arabia.
Specifically targeting any commercial or military ships heading to the Saudi port city of Jeddah.
Exactly. And they aren't hiding this. They are actively broadcasting these threats on open marine VHF channels for the whole world to hear. The source provides a translated quote from a radio transmission where Houthi maritime forces order ships belonging to the, quote, Saudi enemy to immediately alter their course and divert to the Gulf of Aden, warning that non-compliance will make the vessel a legitimate military target.
To understand the gravity of this, you have to look at a map. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait is a narrow passage of water right at the bottom of the Red Sea, situated between Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula and Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. It is only about 18 miles wide at its narrowest point.
It's tiny.
It really is. Millions of barrels of oil and massive amounts of commercial goods pass through this tiny choke point every single day to get to the Suez Canal and onto Europe and the Americas. By threatening ships in this strait, the Houthis effectively control the valve on the global economy.
Okay, let's visualize the mechanics of this. It's like a heavily armed militia closing the main multi-lane artery of global trade and forcing the world's economy to take dirt back roads.
Right.
If shipping companies decide the insurance premiums are too high or the risk of a missile strike is too great, they have to bypass the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait entirely. That means massive cargo ships have to sail all the way south, down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and back up the Atlantic.
But I want to push back on this a bit because a lot of listeners might be thinking, okay, so ships take a longer route. I live in Texas or Ohio or London. The U.S. produces a lot of its own oil. Why does a bottleneck in the Red Sea mechanically spike gas prices at my local station?
That is a critical question, and it comes down to the mechanics of global commodity markets and maritime logistics. Oil is a fungible, globally traded commodity. Its price isn't determined locally, it's determined by global supply and demand.
Okay, so it's all connected.
Exactly. Rerouting a massive fleet of supertankers around the entire continent of Africa adds roughly 30 days to the shipping route. Think about the cascading mathematics of that. That requires burning billions of gallons of extra maritime fuel per month globally just to move the ships.
Oh.
It ties up the vessels for an extra month, meaning there are fewer ships available worldwide to pick up new cargo. It drastically increases crew costs and skyrockets maritime insurance premiums.
So it's a massive sudden restriction in the flow of the global supply.
Right. When the supply flow slows down, the global market panics, and the price of a barrel of oil shoots up everywhere instantly, regardless of where it was pumped out of the ground. The source points out that this kind of sustained supply chain disruption could easily send gas prices soaring to $4 or $5 a gallon very quickly in the U.S. and much higher in Europe.
And when fuel prices spike, everything else spikes. The cost of transporting groceries, manufacturing goods, delivering packages, it all relies on diesel and fuel.
Right. Kiriakou warns that this scenario could trigger a global recession and out-of-control inflation simply because a relatively small regional armed group in Yemen has the geographic positioning and the asymmetric missile capabilities to close the Bab el-Mandeb.
And you can't just fix that with domestic policy.
Exactly. Central banks cannot fix this kind of inflation by raising interest rates. You can't print more shipping lanes.
But to understand why this is happening, why Yemen, of all places, is in this unique position to hold the global economy hostage, we have to look at the deep history. And this is where the source completely blew my mind. He traces this exact current moment back to a single diplomatic vote in the year 1990.
It is a stunning example of cause and effect.
It really is a masterclass in the long-tail consequences of international relations. We have to rewind to August 1990. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had just invaded Kuwait. The global community was outraged, and the UN Security Council was drafting a critical resolution to formally authorize the use of military force to expel the Iraqi army.
Right. Now, by sheer coincidence of the rotating schedule, Yemen happened to hold a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council at that specific time.
So the stakes are incredibly high. The U.S. Secretary of State at the time, James Baker, approaches the Yemeni delegation. And Baker doesn't mince words. He basically says, look, you have to vote yes on this resolution. The entire world is on our side. You need to be on the right side of history, or there will be severe consequences.
But Yemen defied the United States. They voted no. They decided to politically align themselves with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And the retaliation from their neighbor, Saudi Arabia, who was terrified of Saddam Hussein and deeply allied with the U.S., was swift, comprehensive, and historically brutal.
Yeah, the economic fallout was instant.
At that time, before 1990, the Yemeni economy was heavily dependent on remittances. There were roughly 2 million Yemeni guest workers living and working in Saudi Arabia, sending money back home to their families.
And Saudi Arabia expelled all of them. They canceled their visas and deported 2 million people in a single day.
The logistical, economic, and humanitarian nightmare of that sudden expulsion is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine the population of a major American city suddenly forced across a border with nothing but what they could carry.
It's just staggering.
Kyriakou describes his first trip to Yemen as a CIA officer shortly after this happened, in June 1991. He says that as his plane was descending into the capital city of Sana'a, he looked out the window, and for 20 minutes from the air, all he could see were seas of people.
Wow.
2 million people living in cardboard boxes and makeshift lean-tos with no roofs, sprawling out into the desert. They were instantly stripped of their income, dumped back into a country that had zero infrastructure to support them, unable to afford food or clean water for their children.
And that single economic shockwave fundamentally broke the country. It was the catalyst for decades of state failure. The source details how Yemen went from being a net food exporter in the late 1970s, a country that could feed itself and others, to a country that basically had to stop growing food because the agricultural economy collapsed.
Right, and instead, desperate farmers switched to cultivating a crop called qat.
Yeah, we need to explain what qat is because it explains the societal degradation. Qat is a plant native to the region that acts as a strong stimulant when the leaves are chewed.
It's somewhat like drinking a highly concentrated, massive pot of coffee, right?
Exactly. It suppresses the appetite and provides a mild euphoria. So you have a starving, economically devastated population where the agricultural sector shifted entirely from sustaining life with food crops to numbing the daily misery with a stimulant.
Kyriakou paints a bleak, dystopian picture of his time there. He talks about seeing men sitting in elevated guard towers with AK-47s, heavily armed to protect their precious qat crops, while their own children suffered from severe malnutrition.
So you have a totally collapsed economy, mass starvation, a generation of angry, displaced young men, and a population high on stimulants. It is the absolute perfect petri dish for a massive, multi-faction civil war.
Which is exactly what happened. And it wasn't just a simple two-sided conflict. The central Yemeni government was being attacked from multiple ideologically opposed angles simultaneously.
Right. In the eastern deserts, the Hadramaut region, which the source notes translates to death has come because the landscape is so brutal, Al-Qaeda set up a massive operational base.
And in the south, you had militant former communists launching attacks. And in the northwest mountains, you had the Zaidi Shia Muslims, a marginalized group who eventually militarized and became the Houthis, rebelling against the central government.
And this endless chaos eventually led to the assassination of the longtime Yemeni president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was killed by a bomb planted in his own mosque after he had temporarily fled to Saudi Arabia.
The instability also drew the United States into a massive secret war long before the current crisis. Kyriakou notes that when he returned to visit Yemen in 2011, he learned that the U.S. military and the CIA were already conducting a highly covert, intensive drone war in Yemen under the Obama administration.
A conflict that most Americans were entirely unaware of because it was kept off the front pages. Fast forward to today, and the Houthis, that group from the northwestern mountains, have essentially won the ground war. They survive years of brutal Saudi military intervention and bombing campaigns. They control the capital and the most important infrastructure in Yemen.
And now they are utilizing advanced anti-ship missiles and drones to choke off the Red Sea. But here's the geopolitical wild card that the source brings in, and this is where the strategic chessboard gets really complex, the Israel factor.
Oh man, yes. This is a crucial, often overlooked piece of the puzzle. Kiriakou points out a very quiet, highly strategic diplomatic move made by Israel recently. Israel is the only country in the world that officially recognizes Somaliland as an independent sovereign nation.
No, I have to stop you there, because if you look at a standard UN map, Somaliland isn't a recognized country. It's considered a breakaway region of Somalia located right across the water from Yemen on the Horn of Africa. Most of the world views it as an autonomous zone, not a state.
Precisely. And by granting that official diplomatic recognition, and by taking the controversial step of opening an embassy there when no one else would, Israel secured something deeply pragmatic in return: a military airbase in Somaliland.
Wow.
That geopolitical loophole puts advanced Israeli military assets roughly 100 miles away from the Houthi strongholds in Yemen.
So if the Houthis start hitting Israeli-linked commercial shipping in the Red Sea, or if the regional situation escalates further, Israel doesn't have to launch retaliatory strikes from hundreds and hundreds of miles away in their own territory, requiring massive aerial refueling operations. They have F-35 fighter jets stationed right next door.
Exactly. But the danger, as Kiriakou warns, is the nature of that potential retaliation. He predicts that if Israel unleashes its air force from that base, they will relentlessly bomb the Houthi-controlled port of Hodeidah.
And he states that past bombing campaigns in this specific region by both Israel and Saudi Arabia have historically not been surgical. The collateral damage is usually immense. They have frequently hit schools, hospitals, water treatment plants, and private homes.
And that kind of widespread civilian devastation is exactly what could ignite a full, uncontrollable regional war. Because it wouldn't just be a localized conflict between Israel and Yemen. The source maps out the terrifying domino effect.
Right. If Saudi Arabia feels threatened by the fallout, Bahrain will immediately jump in because their royal families and military structures are closely allied. If Bahrain jumps in, the United Arab Emirates will likely follow, despite the fact that the UAE recently negotiated a very fragile diplomatic detente with Iran.
You rapidly end up with a massive, multi-front, sectarian, and geopolitical conflict. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, Oman, Jordan, and Israel, all pitted in varying degrees against Iran and its heavily armed proxy in Yemen. That is a nightmare scenario for global stability, and it all traces back to the lingering resentments and economic devastation caused by a single UN vote in 1990.
It really is staggering. Actions have incredibly long tails. The architecture of today's crisis was built over 3 decades ago.
Which perfectly mirrors what we are seeing in American domestic politics, bringing us to segment 4, the midterm strategy and the ghost of 1992. Because just like the tragedy of Yemen is defined by 1990, the current gridlocked U.S. electoral map is defined by a strategic campaign decision made in 1992.
Yeah, the source brilliantly transitions from the physical, kinetic battles in the Middle East to the ideological and structural battles of the upcoming U.S. midterm elections. And Kiriakou begins by highlighting the current highly aggressive messaging strategy of the Republican Party, specifically spearheaded by Speaker of the House Mike Johnson.
We have to talk about this messaging because it is so stark and, frankly, so hyperbolic. The source includes a clip of Mike Johnson framing the upcoming elections not as a policy disagreement over tax rates or health care, but as an existential choice for the survival of the nation.
He literally says that Americans must choose between maintaining a constitutional republic or going down the dark road toward a, quote, communist utopia.
Kiriakou finds this framing both intellectually absurd and highly calculated. He points out the mathematical reality. The actual number of self-identified democratic socialists in the U.S. Congress is incredibly small. We're talking about 4 out of 435 representatives in the House.
That is less than 1% of the legislative body. They do not have the numbers to pass a post office renaming bill on their own, let alone overthrow the capitalist system.
So why use that specific extreme language? Does anyone actually buy this? The source argues that this strategy relies heavily on the American public not actually knowing the definitions of the words they are terrified of. It relies on a complete misunderstanding of the mechanical difference between socialism and communism.
Yeah, Kiriakou tells us a great story about his hometown newspaper, where a reader wrote a furious letter to the editor complaining that restaurant tips being pooled and taken by the wealthy owner was a prime example of socialism.
Right, which Kiriakou points out is the exact opposite. That is just exploitative, unregulated capitalism, the owner taking the surplus value of the labor. True socialism in that scenario would be the waitstaff and the cooks collectively owning the restaurant and dividing the profits equally among themselves.
He also shares a very relatable anecdote about an elderly relative who watches a lot of Fox News and constantly complained to him about the country becoming socialistic. But when Kyriakou sat down and gently pointed out the mechanics of her own life, that her Social Security checks, her Medicare coverage, the public education her grandchildren receive, and the interstate highway system she drives on are all fundamentally socialist concepts where public tax money is pooled and redistributed for the greater collective good, she completely froze.
She simply couldn't reconcile the mechanical reality of those programs with her deeply held political identity.
It creates a cognitive dissonance. If you genuinely believe that pooling resources for the public good is tantamount to Soviet-style communism, then logically you should be demanding the immediate privatization and defunding of the U.S. highway system.
But of course, no one does that.
No, of course not. However, here is the core paradox the source presents to the listener. If this communist threat messaging is so logically flawed, and if it only targets a microscopic fraction of Congress, and if, as the source cites, Donald Trump's approval ratings and the GOP leadership's approval ratings are sitting at historic dismal lows, around 39.7%, why are the Republicans still projected by many models to hold significant power?
Yeah, why might they easily retain control of the House of Representatives despite being broadly unpopular?
And this is where we get to the ghost of 1992. The secret to their power isn't in the rhetoric, it's in the underlying structural map, the invisible architecture. Kyriakou reveals a massive, historically catastrophic strategic blunder made by the Democratic Party over 3 decades ago.
Following Bill Clinton's first presidential victory in 1992, Hillary Clinton allegedly advised the campaign and the Democratic National Committee to radically change their funding strategy. She advised them to focus their financial resources exclusively on states they could realistically win the presidency in.
Meaning, the National Party effectively stopped spending money, stopped organizing, and stopped supporting local candidates in deep red states. The Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, Idaho, Montana. They looked at the Electoral College map, decided those states were lost causes for the presidency, and simply abandoned the local state-level races there to save money.
And we really need to dig into the mechanics of why the ripple effect of that single decision was structurally catastrophic for the Democrats. Because they vacated the playing field in those rural states, Republicans didn't just win elections, they were able to build unchecked generational supermajorities in the state legislatures.
We are talking about commanding majorities of 2/3 or more in the state houses and state senates.
And why does a 2/3 majority in a local state house matter so much for the balance of power in the National Congress in Washington, D.C.?
Because of 2 massive structural powers. First, with a supermajority, the state legislature can easily override the veto of a governor. So even if a state occasionally elects a moderate Democratic governor, the Republican legislature can completely ignore them and pass whatever extreme legislation they want.
But the second power is the real weapon.
Yes. The state legislatures are the ones who draw the congressional district boundaries every 10 years after the census.
This is the absolute core of the issue, gerrymandering, the mechanics of redistricting. By controlling the state houses so thoroughly for decades, Republicans executed strategies like Project IRA map following the 2010 census. They used advanced software to redraw the maps, utilizing techniques known as packing and cracking.
Right. Explain how packing and cracking works mechanically, because it's insidious.
Sure. Packing is when the legislature draws a district line to cram as many opposing voters, say Democrats, into a single bizarrely shaped district as possible. That district will elect a Democrat with 90% of the vote, effectively wasting all those surplus votes.
And cracking.
Cracking is when they take the remaining Democratic voters and split them up across several surrounding Republican-heavy districts, ensuring they're always a minority of maybe 40% and can never win a seat. The result is that a state with a 50-50 popular vote split can easily send 10 Republicans and 2 Democrats to the U.S. House of Representatives.
It mathematically insulates the politicians from the will of the overall popular vote. The source notes that James Carville, Bill Clinton's legendary campaign manager, the guy who famously coined the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," was so apoplectic about this 1992 strategy of abandoning red states that he ended up resigning over it.
Wow, he resigned over it.
He did. He looked at the mechanics of the system and saw the long-term generational damage it would do to the party's foundation.
And that deeply entrenched structural advantage is exactly why the forecasts for the upcoming midterms are so agonizingly tight. Despite the historically low approval ratings for the GOP leadership, the gerrymandered map protects them like a fortress.
Kiriakou cites polling experts like Nate Silver and analysis from the New York Times, showing predictions that range from a very modest 11-seat pickup for the Democrats to the Republicans actually maintaining firm control of the House.
The structural advantage built in the 1990s acts as an impenetrable firewall against current political unpopularity. It doesn't matter if the messaging is flawed, if the map is rigged.
Exactly. It's going to take decades and billions of dollars in local organizing for the Democrats to even begin to undo the structural damage of that single 1992 funding decision.
But the 1990s Clinton era wasn't just a pivotal time for domestic electoral maps. It was also a period of massive, deadly, and deeply hidden dysfunction inside the U.S. intelligence community. And that dysfunction brings us to our fifth and final segment: James Woolsey, Aldrich Ames, and the terrifying reality of Havana Syndrome.
This segment brilliantly bridges the gap between historical intelligence failures of the past and modern, highly sophisticated, unresolved security threats of the present. It begins with the recent passing of James Woolsey at the age of 86.
Woolsey was a towering, highly respected figure in Washington. He was a lifelong Democrat who had served in significant defense and intelligence roles under Presidents Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. He was seen as a brilliant, bipartisan technocrat.
Right.
When Bill Clinton became president in 1993, he named Woolsey as his CIA director, fully expecting him to be the competent, steady adult in the room. But Woolsey's tenure was a disaster. He only lasted 23 months.
His time as director was completely derailed by one of the most catastrophic, bloody counterintelligence failures in American history: the unmasking of the Aldrich Ames spy ring.
The source's description of how this happened is chilling because it highlights a massive systemic failure. Aldrich Ames was not some James Bond super spy. He was a known, chronic alcoholic with a history of sloppy behavior.
Yeah, yet through sheer bureaucratic inertia, he somehow got promoted to become the director of counterintelligence in the Soviet Operations Division of the CIA. In that role, he had unrestricted access to the true identities of literally every recruited CIA asset operating inside the Soviet Union and Russia.
And he sold them out, every single one of them. For a few $1 million, Ames provided the names of America's most valuable spies to the KGB. The mechanics of the fallout were brutal. The source notes that these assets were systematically hunted down, arrested, and executed, one by one, with a bullet to the back of the head in a Moscow basement.
It was painfully statistically obvious to anyone paying attention that there was a high-level mole operating inside the agency. The sudden loss of that many assets couldn't be a coincidence.
But Woolsey's reaction as the director of the CIA was completely baffling, and it speaks to a toxic culture of elite protectionism. Even after Ames was finally caught by the FBI, Woolsey absolutely refused to clean house.
He refused to fire, demote, or even reassign anyone in the management chain of command who had allowed this sloppy, drunk traitor to keep getting promoted while assets were being murdered.
The culture of unaccountability was so strong, and the internal pushback against firing anyone was so fierce that President Clinton was outraged. The White House eventually forced Woolsey to resign in disgrace, which led Woolsey to become incredibly bitter, switch political parties, and actively endorse Republican Bob Dole for president in 1996.
Aldrich Ames ended up spending the rest of his life in a federal supermax prison, dying just recently. But the story of James Woolsey takes a very strange, very modern, and deeply unsettling turn upon his death.
The official obituaries in the major papers stated that Woolsey died of natural causes, specifically a stroke. But the obituaries included a startling, quiet revelation directly from his family. Woolsey had been suffering from Havana Syndrome for the last 4 years of his life.
Let's pause there because that is an absolute bombshell. I want to frame this for the listener. It's like finding out the head security guard of a massive bank was violently robbed and beaten using a high-tech weapon that the bank officially claims does not exist.
Havana Syndrome first made international headlines when U.S. diplomats and intelligence officers stationed in Cuba started experiencing sudden, extreme symptoms: severe dizziness, nausea, vertigo, and rapid, debilitating cognitive decline.
They described hearing a strange, piercing noise or feeling intense pressure in their heads just before the symptoms started. But the official CIA and State Department investigations have repeatedly downplayed this. At one point, a commission report actually tried to blame the symptoms on the sound of indigenous crickets,
Literally crickets chirping at a specific irritating frequency.
which Kiriakou, along with many other intelligence professionals, dismisses as complete insulting nonsense. The cricket theory ignores the physical mechanics of the injuries. He points out that the victims of these attacks are not hysterical hypochondriacs who get confused by loud bugs.
Right.
Furthermore, they have objective medical proof. Neurologists at places like the University of Pennsylvania have examined these victims and have MRIs documenting actual physical traumatic brain injury, specifically damage to the white matter tracts of the brain, without any history of concussions or blunt force trauma.
The source specifically mentions other high-profile victims to prove this isn't just a few stressed diplomats. He mentions Mark Polymeropoulos, a highly decorated former CIA Moscow station chief, and Bill Binney, a renowned legendary NSA whistleblower. These are top-tier, battle-hardened intelligence officials suffering from documented, career-ending brain damage.
We have to discuss the mechanics of how this weapon actually works, because it moves it from the realm of science fiction into terrifying reality. The prevailing theory among independent experts and victims, which the source aligns with, is that someone is using advanced directed energy weapons, specifically pulsed microwave radiation.
How does a microwave weapon cause a concussion without breaking the skull?
It's based on something called the Frey effect, or the microwave auditory effect. When a targeted beam of pulsed microwaves hits the human head, the energy is rapidly absorbed by the brain tissue. This causes a microscopic, rapid expansion of the tissue thermal elastic expansion.
It essentially creates a shock wave inside the skull.
Exactly. The victim hears a loud click or a buzzing sound, which is the physical acoustic wave bouncing around inside their head. And the repeated microscopic trauma to the brain tissue results in symptoms identical to a severe concussion or traumatic brain injury.
And the reality of the threat, according to the source, is that someone, whether it's the Russians, the Chinese, the Israelis, or even rogue factions within the U.S. intelligence apparatus itself, is using these directed energy weapons to systematically target people who possess or have possessed access to the nation's most sensitive, highly classified secrets.
Which brings us back to James Woolsey. What does it fundamentally mean for the security of the United States if a former director of the CIA, even one who had a highly controversial tenure in the 1990s, is targeted and becomes a victim of a weaponized microwave frequency that the U.S. government officially downplays or denies?
It suggests a level of vulnerability at the very top of the intelligence food chain that is deeply unsettling. It means the people in charge cannot even protect themselves in their own homes.
It connects perfectly back to the very beginning of our deep dive, the illusion of the visible architecture. We assume the people at the top of the skyscraper are protected by impenetrable security, just as we assume that legally mandated documents will naturally be released by the government, or that our global supply chains are physically secure, or that our electoral maps reflect the actual will of the voters. We assume there is a rational blueprint.
But the deeper you look into the mechanics of these events, the more you realize the blueprint is a forgery. Which brings us to our synthesis of everything we've unpacked today. We started with the Epstein Files, 3.5 million pages of suppressed, highly classified documents, and a political party ruthlessly tearing itself apart, spending tens of millions of dollars and using SCIF intimidation tactics just to keep them hidden from the public.
We then moved to the Red Sea and Yemen, where a single, vengeful diplomatic slight in 1990, the expulsion of 2 million workers, helped create a starving, collapsed state. A state that is now utilizing asymmetric warfare to hold the entire global economy hostage through a naval blockade that threatens to spike inflation worldwide.
We looked at the American electoral map, completely gerrymandered and structurally locked down by supermajorities, all because of a single campaign spending decision made by the Democrats to abandon rural states in 1992.
And we ended with the tragic and mysterious death of a former CIA director, a man who oversaw a devastating, bloody intelligence failure due to a culture of unaccountability, ultimately falling victim to an unacknowledged directed energy weapon that the government pretends is just the sound of crickets.
The through line connecting all of this is undeniable. Secrets, buried histories, and long-term structural manipulations have profound, violent, real-world consequences. When you hide the blueprints, the building doesn't just stand there silently, it rots from the inside out. The structural failures compound over decades, and eventually, the hidden rot violently breaks through the drywall and becomes a public, unavoidable crisis.
And speaking of hidden crises, just waiting to break through the drywall, the source leaves us with one final, deeply unexplored thread that should give everyone listening serious pause. Amidst all the geopolitical chaos, Kiriakou briefly mentions a story that is breaking very slowly, largely ignored by the mainstream domestic political outlets. A new, highly complex U.S.-Saudi nuclear power deal.
Right. This is the unseen pillar. The Saudis have been pushing for this kind of nuclear technology transfer since the 1980s. They insist publicly that they need to enrich uranium domestically to build nuclear power plants for electricity. But as the source points out, mechanically and geographically, this makes zero sense.
Saudi Arabia is one of the sunniest, most arid countries on Earth. They have massive coastlines and endless desert wind. They could power their entire nation 10 times over with solar and wind infrastructure at a fraction of the cost. Yet they are singularly, obsessively focused on uranium enrichment capabilities.
The conventional wisdom among intelligence analysts and the firm belief of many former CIA officers cited by the source is that the Saudis aren't looking for cheap electricity. They're looking for the fissile material to build a nuclear weapon.
In fact, the source notes a terrifying rumor within the intelligence community. Some veterans believe Saudi Arabia has already bypassed the R&D phase and purchased an off-the-shelf, fully functional nuclear weapon directly from Pakistan and are simply waiting for the right geopolitical moment to reveal it.
So, as you go about your day, as you watch the news and see gas prices rise because of a proxy war blockade in the Red Sea, as you watch American politicians scream at each other over communist labels and fight desperate battles over hidden documents, ask yourself this. What happens to the world order when the country sitting at the absolute center of this Middle Eastern powder keg suddenly emerges as a fully armed, declared nuclear power right at the exact moment the United States is entirely paralyzed and distracted by its own internal turmoil?
That is the ultimate hidden architecture, the piece of the foundation we aren't allowed to look at until the entire building comes crashing down around us.
We started this deep dive talking about the visible structures of the world. And as we've seen, the true load-bearing pillars are entirely submerged in shadow. The blueprints are classified, the foundations are cracking, and the people holding the answers are either violently hiding them or falling victim to invisible weapons. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the surface-level narratives, keep looking for the hidden mechanics behind the news, and we'll see you next time.